That's how we learn. We have to talk to each other, listen to each other's research. Otherwise, we are nowhere. Unfortunately, in Pakistani universities, एक रीत बन गई है कि हम साइलोज में बैठे हुए एक दूसरे की रिसर्च को जान के नहीं देखते, ऐसे आंखें बंद कर लेते हैं जब कोई रिसर्च आए। हम कहते हैं यार ये मैंने नहीं देखनी, पता नहीं क्या जेलसी है या क्या है, क्योंकि हम चाहते नहीं एक दूसरे की रिसर्च देखें। बहुत कम लोग हैं जो इनवाइट करते हैं एक दूसरे को सेमिनार के लिए। मैं अपने लोगों को हमेशा कहता हूँ जाके कहीं सेमिनार दो, एंड दे फाइंड इट डिफिकल्ट टू डू अ सेमिनार। मुझे याद है व्हेन आई वाज स्टडीइंग ओवरसीज, तो इट वाज ऑलमोस्ट कंसिडर्ड मैंडेटरी कि आप सेमिनार दें, और अगर आप सेमिनार ना दें तो आप बहुत बुरे समझे जाते थे। और मैंने बहुत गलती की कि मैंने बचपन में सेमिनार ज्यादा नहीं दिए, और देने चाहिए थे बहुत ज्यादा। तो मैं आप सबको ये कहता हूँ कि जी वी मस्ट फाइंड न्यू रिसर्च, एंड वी मस्ट talk to new researchers and learn from their work. Every research work, agree or disagree, has something to teach you. We are not eulogizing anybody by inviting him to do a seminar. Seminar is what we do. मैं हमेशा कहता हूँ कि तरखान धंधे चलाता है, टेबल बनाता है, नान भाई नान लगाता है। हमारा क्या काम है? हमारा काम रिसर्च करना और बकवास करना है। अगर हम वो सेमिनार नहीं करते तो फिर हमारा काम तो अधूरा रह गया ना। अगर रिसर्च करके हमने फेंक दिया, कोई फायदा नहीं। मुझे बड़े अफसोस की बात है, आई थिंक यूनिवर्सिटीज आर लर्निंग अ लिटिल बिट बट बाय नॉट इनफ। मैं तो कोशिश कर रहा हूँ हर यूनिवर्सिटी में, मुझे बड़ी खुशी होगी अगर मैं देखूं कि हर यूनिवर्सिटी में रोज सेमिनार शुरू हो रहे हैं। मुझे अक्सर कहते हैं टीचर्स और ये और वो, मतलब कि जी हमारे पास टाइम नहीं है। तो क्या कर रहे हैं, किस चीज का टाइम है? क्या वजह है कि दुनिया में रॉबर्ट सोलो, रॉबर्ट लूकस, साला गैरी बेकर, डैरेन एसिमोग्लू, जो भी बड़े नाम है, वो रोज बैठे सेमिनार सुन रहे होते हैं। तो क्या हम बहुत बड़े हैं कि हम सेमिनार नहीं सुन सकते? तो इस स्पिरिट के साथ हम कोशिश करते हैं बार बार। आई थॉट इट वाज टाइम दैट आई सेड दिस, बिकॉज अभी मैंने देखा है कि कुछ लोग हमारे वो they're holding a what are you saying, they're holding a conference, but they refuse to acknowledge that somebody else has done something. They just have some donors and their friends there. They don't want to talk about what others have done, which is a very bad tradition. I think we should learn from that. जो सारी आई है क्या कहते हैं डेवलपमेंट, वो आई है फ्रॉम पीपल एज वो अपना क्या नाम है उसका, न्यूटन सेड, standing on the shoulders of giants. Nobody sits there doing things alone. So in that spirit today, I thought it was important to invite Chohan Saab. Usman Chohan is, mashallah, a very bright young economist who's joined CAS. And CAS is the Center for Aerospace Studies, which is a think tank in which there's a strong economics component now. And Chohan has written a number of books. Usman has written a number of books, which is very, very important to bear in mind. I think he's written about 6 books. And this is 6th book that we are looking at. In fact, Chohan Sahab, we should do a webinar on each of them, even if we are in omission. We did do that earlier. We should rectify our mistakes always. So I think it's a very important thing to hear from him. He has done this public value and the post-pandemic society, a very intriguing title, very intriguing title, and I'd love to learn from it. All kinds of questions come to my mind, but I leave them till I've heard Usman talk about it. So Usman Sahab, over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir Nadeem, it's a privilege here. I entirely share the spirit with which you have offered me this space to share some ideas from my 6th book, as you correctly noted. I'm honored to be here. और जैसे आपने कहा कि थोड़ी सी बकवास करनी और बकवास सुननी भी चाहिए, if I paraphrase, तो मैं थोड़ी सी बकवास अब करूँगा. And I would like to share some of the findings of this book. I first want to test if you can see the screen, my slideshow.
Yes, we can. We can.
So thank you. So this is a sequel, in fact. This book titled Public Value and the Post-Pandemic Society is a sequel to a book called Pandemics and Public Value Management. As a background, public value is a theory that they teach to bureaucrats. They teach it at mid-level public administration, MPA programs to people who are mid-career in the US public service, in the federal government, for example. And the idea is that you have two things to do. You have to address the values of society, of American society or any other society, and you have to create value for them. So you can see the parallel with how private companies create value, and it's measured in profit at the bottom line. Public, you can't really measure that. And of course, this is an idea you, Dr. Nadeem, and your team well understand, because you are constantly analyzing the value destruction created by government here, as well as the value preservation, the value creation. All of the issues of government are subsumed within public value, but public value is a feel-good theory targeted with its audience being the bureaucrats. So, the main question I had in mind, and I wanted to use public value as the lens for it, was, is the post-pandemic era worse than the pandemic? So the first thing that I remarked upon in chapter 1 is that there's a big problem with public value theory, where it says that you should look at how one government program is creating value in this or that way. And there was virtually no serious scholarship, virtually none at all, during COVID-19 that was public value. So the biggest thing that was happening around us, it was only 4 years ago, there was no public value interest in the biggest event in the world. And so that's what book 4 was, that why don't public value scholars wake up to see the role of government, which was very significant during the pandemic, whether they chose to lock things down, whether they chose to issue stimulus, monetary stimulus, whether they chose to keep people alive or not in various ways. And yet there was no public value scholarship. So this was a follow-up to that. And the question is, are we in a post-pandemic era really? And if we are, then how good or bad is this condition? Is it the same? Is it worse? Is it better? And it's hard to say, because you can contest the idea that we may not even be in a post-pandemic era, since COVID is still around. I actually got COVID 6 months ago, and it was much, much worse than during the pandemic. So this thing is still around. So it's debatable. And so how do you define this era? Well, that's what chapter 1 deals with. And when you want to deal with the post-pandemic society, you must create a panorama. That's what I sought to do. And so I divided it into 3 parts. There's the changes and transitions that have happened between pre-pandemic, pandemic, post-pandemic. Then I looked at the lens of asymmetries that are magnified. They were either magnified during the pandemic or in the post-pandemic condition. And then the third part is the issues of resilience, withstanding crises, as well as learning from crises. These were the various chapters of the book. And there is a diagram. So this is an example, I feel, of complex storytelling, because you're basically painting a picture of how the world is, which is a very ambitious thing to do because the world is very large and complex. But it has 3 parts, and then each part has 3 chapters within it. And it's constructed in this manner that you see in this slide. The 5 key arguments that I arrived at, and I issued them in the introduction and then revisit them at the conclusion of the book, are that societies are undergoing transitions that reflect the aftermath of the pandemic, obviously, but post-pandemic hardships are in many cases worse than the pandemic itself. This depends on context, interpersonal context, social context, etc. But in some cases, at least, and I say in fact quite a few, it's worse now than it used to be. The third argument is that asymmetries and inequalities are considerably worsening post-pandemic public value destruction or disvalue. So inequalities are making things a lot worse than they need to be. The fourth thing is that there are lessons to draw from COVID-19 pandemic, which can help embed resilience. It's funny how people just don't like to talk about the pandemic anymore, as if it never even occurred, which is a monstrous error in my view. Societies collectively, as well as individuals, have a tendency after some lapse of time to forget traumas. For example, I did not know that there was an influenza pandemic in the early 20th century because it's kind of blurred into the interwar period, but it was such a monstrous thing. It was such a destructive thing. And that's how it is. We just don't talk about such things once they happen. And finally, multi-stakeholder engagement is required to overcome post-pandemic challenges. So this is what the book rests on. So I start out with the question that if you have to look at values of people, is it really even different after the pandemic as opposed to during or before the pandemic? And the question is, public value is very limited as a theory because it doesn't engage with what else is going on. And the best area, the best domain where values have been studied, people's values, is actually psychology, because they test a lot. Whatever research methods are deployed
Yeah,
in psychology.
Usman Sahab, if I may, can you
Sir,
just give us a brief discourse on public value theory because I don't know much about it.
absolutely. So, public value theory has two parts to it. The value created by government, which cannot really be measured, but it exists, at least if government is working right. And at PIDE, you know that government often messes up things a lot. So there's value created or disvalue created, value as in the bottom line. And then there's the question of the values that bureaucrats have to address. So if government is addressing what the people want, it is doing its job well, in principle. The main tool that they use for shaping public value is this triangle you see, where there are three agents that it particularly addresses. And you can probably guess there's a fourth one, which is the private sector, which it doesn't look at, but it's a very big deal, the private sector. The other three agents are civil society, politicians, and public managers. So it divides between elected officials as opposed to technocrats in ministries. And these are the agents in public value. And through a concerted effort to share ideas, address the values of the public, these agents can co-create value in society. This is the crux of public value. And public value is deployed often in a case study format where you look at, for example, how water management systems in Mexico were improved through a concerted effort where they took inputs from society and then the bureaucrats worked on it, etc. Case study approaches are used. And it's a very feel-good theory, public value, because it's telling the bureaucrat who is mid-career that he is a protagonist, he's the good guy, and he creates value, and that he should be speaking to the values of people. That's what public value aims at. But if you have a feel-good theory that you teach, if you create basically ideology as pedagogy, then you create certain lapses. And that's where I've basically worked on 5 books out of the 6, where I said, well, if you really want to take seriously the role of government, you have to look at how awful government can be. And you can make a full career out of that. And that's what these 5 books do. And my concern is particularly for uh, public value scholars. So people who teach in Masters of Public Administration, for example, and how their research is not looking at the contemporary problems that we face, whether it was the pandemic or the world today. So that's public values theory summary. And what you see in this triangle is that if values are changing or not changing, how often do they change? So I sought a synthesis between the psychology literature and with public value theory. So a public administration theory called public value. And actually, there's a lot of commonality between the areas of interest in the psychology literature and public value. For example, how to measure what values people hold, how to categorize them, and how to assess transitions and change in them. So here's the funny thing about values. If values of people change very often, then they're not values in the sense that we understand as deeply held beliefs that are a compass to guide us in life, right? Because they change too often. But if values are so firmly fixed that they cannot be moved in any circumstance, that means that you basically have nothing to do except wait for a generation to die off, and a new generation will emerge with new values because you just can't do anything. People are so strict. So the truth that is arrived at in this chapter by seeking the synthesis between psychology and public value is that there is room for some transition because of traumas, because of the state of life you were in, because of the environmental impacts, and so on. So there is room to assess people being different. Now, if I ask people, are you different now as opposed to before the pandemic? And people say, no, they're absolutely the same. Like I believe I'm absolutely the same. But there are people who have gone through hell and back, and they have changed dramatically as people because of what happened. So there is room to assess a change in values. That's what this chapter was about. Then I look at some other major changes that are different, and I'll skip over this in the interest of time, but the issue of inflation and stagflation, which is a big deal in a country like Pakistan because our productivity, as your assessments at PIDE have shown, are low, and yet inflation continues to be high. And this is not something unique to Pakistan. It's actually a big deal in the third world. But also, inflation has been a political issue and a very big issue in societies everywhere, including the quote first world. So I looked at the major causes that are driving this and how it's value destructive because everything's price is going up, but purchasing power collapses and so on. So it's just a bit of a dull chapter, but it's an important thing to note about how the post-pandemic society is shaping up. Then another major change that I wanted to cover in this was in people's value or self-worth, their self-value, as expressed in the Great Resignation. So there was this movement during the pandemic where a lot of people resigned en masse voluntarily. And this was true around the world, but it was particularly true in Europe and America because many people saw death up close. And so they were shaken up by it and they decided that life is too short. We should do what we really want to do. So many people left their work, their day jobs. Some started businesses, some moved to other companies. And so it was a very interesting phenomena that people valued their labor and their time differently because they had experienced the end of life. Either a loved one passed away or they were in confinement and locked down for so long that it drove them half mad. So, as expressed through their decisions on where to work and how to work, and it applies to bureaucrats too, because public managers, so bureaucrats or workers, they're also responding to society's articulated values, and they also regulate how things work, including how the labor market works. So they have multiple roles within this, and that's what I tease out. The second part of the book, beginning with chapter 5, looks at two types of inequalities. There's inequalities within publics, and there's inequality between publics. So the lens for inequality within publics started with the idea that inequality was considerably worse, and economic inequality, socioeconomic inequality was worsened by the pandemic, and this has actually persisted through. And so there is a question of, well, as a value, we should actually take a step back and look at, as a value, do people have a problem with really have a problem with inequality? Because although in the rhetoric, everybody thinks that inequality is a bad thing, but our actions suggest that we really don't care so much as long as we're on the good side of that equation. And that's what I tease out through various frameworks in public value. And then there's inequality between public. So here I inserted the case study of Sri Lanka and the collapse of Sri Lanka, as we saw, the collapse of Colombo, where Sri Lanka, for example, was not a belligerent in the Russia-Ukraine war, but it was probably the country most affected outside of those two belligerents. Why? Because of embedded vulnerabilities and how their government and how their society had emerged and the policies that they had undertaken over time, which created a huge vulnerability. But then the economic architecture rests on things like tourism, which didn't exist, and so on. So I built a case study of Sri Lanka and say, not everybody is well equipped to deal with the crises that are emerging in the world, and oftentimes it may or may not be their fault. Only to a certain degree can you blame Sri Lanka for the condition it's in. But at the same time, it is responsible to some extent. So that this inequality, because it was not well positioned for this type of stress, it ended up being in a terrible situation. And that's what I tease out. Now, here's an interesting chapter. We now move to part 3 of the book, which is necropolitics.
Sorry. Johan sir, can you please go back to the last slide?
Sure, sir.
Why is the triangle kind of shrunk?
You mean this funny shape, the PV agents thing?
Yeah, why has that shrunk?
Just it's a formatting issue more than anything.
Yeah, I thought you were making a point. Okay, no problem. No, go ahead.
It's a formatting issue more than anything. Thank you. So, necropolitics is a concept that emerged post 9/11. There is a Cameroonian intellectual, Achille Mbembe, who looked at the way his argument, based in psychology and political science, was that governments are very much in the business of issuing death, controlling how we die, which is a successor to what Michel Foucault in the 1970s argued was that governments are in the business of determining life, biopolitics. So Foucault's argument was biopolitics, that Governments shape our lives in terrible ways, and how we live our lives is shaped by it through, for example, the school system. And so PIDE, for example, has done work on the education system and its defects. So the fact that that exists shapes our lives. Similarly, the jails and the prisons shape our lives. So who is confined, why, and how, the justice system, and a poorly effectuated justice system, etc. So that's what living in the Cold War, Michel Foucault was deeply disturbed by, because on both sides of the Iron Curtain, governments were monstrous in how they determined lives. So after 9/11, Achille Mbembe took this a step that they're not just in the business of how we live, but also in the business of how we die. Now, this became accentuated in the pandemic because it was very, very directly attributable to government policy, whether at two extremes, either some governments in some countries kept societies completely open, and then there was ramifications of that, right? Because vulnerable communities were elderly people, for example, were decimated. At the other extreme, total lockdown disproportionately affected, for example, young people who were not susceptible to early variants of COVID, or working people, so people who house breadwinners, let's say, they were just so extremes were terrible. So necropolitics came into acute focus, and so what I look at is the synthesis between public value, which is a feel-good theory, and necropolitics, which is a very dismal view of the world. Not that it's untrue, it's true, but it's so dismal. So we have to have between one feel-good and one feel-bad concept, a synthesis. And the idea is that there is a lot for both theories to learn from each other. Disease and war and natural disasters and economic hardship are just some of the manifestations of post-pandemic necropolitics. And what can necropolitics gain? Well, the focus that public value puts on values. So why do agents do what they do? And what are their value systems is an interesting way. Why is the government in the business of death? And what public value can gain from necropolitics is the critique of government. So governments as less than perfect entities. This is something for our times. And so politicians are the legislators, articulators, and directors of necropolitics. Civil society can be either a supporter or detractor of programs like that, and public managers are the executors. So this is the relationship as framed in public value. Now, here's the tricky question. What if the public values like it likes necropolitics, as in people, for example, I would have said that, keep the economy open. To hell with the old folks. What if I value that? Right? That kind of problem. Or what if I were a very aged person vulnerable to COVID, and I said, no, keep everything closed so I'm safe. And I value that. But other people are adversely affected by that. So that's the uncomfortable question that arises from this. Now, sustainability, we understand it as a buzzword. In PIDE's Islah manifesto yesterday, one critique was that it didn't look directly at climate change, although it's perfectly understandable why you wouldn't cover everything under the sun, but you would rather focus on certain things. Sustainability is a buzzword, but there is an interesting post-pandemic study of sustainability worth looking at, and I use the floods of 2022 in Pakistan. And I look particularly at the narratives that emerged from this crisis. So human beings have a tendency to try to make meaning in crisis. It's just a tendency. It's not good or bad. It's just what we do, try to understand it. And so I noticed three narratives that emerged in Pakistan from various people, various political orientations, and various blame ascriptions that emerged from that. And each is understandable in its internal context, its internal consistency, although you may not be an adherent to any or all of them. So one thing that happened after the floods occurred in Pakistan is this divine wrath perspective, which is a far right orientation, because it says the public has strayed. This damnation or this punishment is divine, and it's because it's a retribution for how terrible we are as a people. We have gone astray. It sounds funny when I say it in English, लेकिन अगर मैं आपसे कहूँ कि ये अल्लाह का अजाब था और चूंकि ये मुआशरा इतना बिगड़ चुका है, इतना खराब हो चुका है, तो अल्लाह हिसाब ले रहा है, जिस तरह कितनी सारी कौमों से तारीख में लिया गया है। और ये अब क्योंकि हम इतने खराब हो चुके हैं, ऐसी चीजें अब होंगी और ज्यादा होंगी. This is an understandable thing, particularly for people who are of a superstitious temperament. But that's fine. The second one is the failed system approach. This was more in the center, and you heard this more from educated people. And this is something, perhaps if I were to converse with people at PIDE, this is probably the language in which we would arrive at it, that if you don't plan, if you have budgetary shortfalls, corruption, squabbling, power structures that are, you know, asymmetrical, bad policies that lead to deforestation, the perpetuation of poverty. If you have a society like this and this government that is inept, then this is exactly what will happen with floods. These kinds of disasters happen everywhere in the world, but why is it that we become such a mess because of it, right? Is it that we're simply incapable? Well, we have all the resources to deal with this, but we just don't because it's a mindset problem, right? That kind of thing. So that's the centrist approach. And then there's the left liberal approach, which is climate injustice, which was outwards oriented, which raises a valid point that if we are 4% of the world's population, but less than 1% of the emissions, then why is it that we are bearing the brunt of this? It's so unfair. There's a climate injustice thing. And particularly when speaking to outward audiences, like at the UN or something, we would bring this one up. So the funny thing is that as a public, we retain all of these at some degree in our minds, depending on who we are speaking to. And all can be true at the same time. So if you look at the floods, well, what are the responsibilities? For politicians, there's the squabbling part, lack of commitment to this, corruption, etc. For public managers, incompetence. Sir Nadeem has consistently pointed out that it's not just that people are evil. No, it's that there's a competency issue, right? Yeah. Budgetary shortfalls and other issues also come there, as well as civil society. So disengagement with the subject, apathy, um, not taking things seriously, right? So we are all, to some degree, in some ways, responsible for our collective anjam, our conclusion as a society. So just another way to frame it. And the question is, which do you agree with? Well, you probably to some degree agree with all of these things in some contexts, in some ways. Chapter 9 then looks at future pandemic preparedness. There is this concept known as disease X, that there is something that will be so terrifying, so contagious, so virulent, so deadly, that when it erupts, we just won't be able to cope with it. And so we have to anticipate it, but we just don't know what exactly it will be. That's the disease X concept in research. COVID was not disease X. Disease X will be much, much worse. But there was this panel created called the IPPPR. It was under a UN mandate in a sense, or many UN people were involved in it, and it came up with a solid group of recommendations that you need to have a better WHO that's more focused and independent. You need to have a treaty for a pandemic. You need a global threats council. All of these high-minded ivory tower things are in it, which would be nice. But how likely are they to occur? It's hard to say. So far, you don't see an appetite for these things. You need to have a pre-negotiated platform for vaccines, therapeutics. You need to have proactive surveillance, multi-stakeholder engagement. It's a lot of blah, blah, and it's good blah, blah. It's very nice to have this. But here's the problem, that societies don't really learn from mistakes. And the public policy literature has done a lot on this, where if something happens, do you really learn from it? Tragically, human beings have a tendency not to learn from their mistakes. And that's partly why history has a cyclical bent to it, where the same nonsense tends to recur in various intervals across human history. So that's the tragedy, where the post-pandemic society offers us the occasion to reflect on what has happened, but we're unlikely to do so. And tragically for me, there isn't enough reflecting on what has happened, and we always just seem to be blindsided. One day, country X invades country Y. The next day, there's an attack by country Z on country B, and so on. It's just all a mess, and we constantly are blindsided, even though if we look back, the signs were always written on the wall, right? So that there's public value destruction from that. So here you see a diagram of how each of my arguments is embedded in each of the chapters. And don't need to repeat that. But what this book ultimately ends up being is complex storytelling. So it bears testament to a specific time, and it's a time we live in now, so it may be of value to future scholars looking at concepts that are a little bit amorphous, like value or people's values, but that really have a bearing on our lived experience. And there is a serious need for consideration. And it is always tricky to paint a sober or comprehensive picture, but I gave it a shot. And this is how the map of the book ends up being. I would recommend it to people who are not necessarily into public administration or economics, because there may be things that resonate with you, things that you've witnessed, but you've sort of let slide to keep your conscience alive in our difficult time. So this was the sixth book, and I have two coming up soon. They're edited volumes, and they tend to be in the same vein as the 2021 book, The Digital Economy. So I will keep going, and I like this exercise very much. So thank you. Thank you for your patience and listening to some of my thoughts as manifested in this book. So that is it for me.
Thank you, Usman Sab. Thank you. I think it's very nice, very interesting. I'd like to start by asking you a couple of questions. One is, um, how does this public value, I want to focus a little bit on public value because I think it's worth exploring. How does your public value differ from Mazakuto's analysis of value of everything? Or is it the same?
Oh, it's very much the same, sir. You've raised a very interesting question, because Mariana Mazzucato is a public value scholar.
Uh-huh.
She is very much of that tradition. And I mean, in the journals that focus on public value, she has written papers. And so I have come across her public value stuff, including some stuff she touched upon briefly in the pandemic. So when she talks about the value of everything, and she argues, for example, for a more compassionate or driven government to re-empower government to solve problems, she is coming from a very strong public value mindset. So yes, she is very much of that tradition.
Okay. Then a follow-up, a very simple question that, we all want the government to be altruistic. And we all want the government to create public value. So one is the question of what is public value. We'll get to it, but but I'd take a different view. Let's take Buchanan's approach to public policy, right? Now, Buchanan doesn't trust the government, as most economists, even I don't trust the government, because whenever you give somebody control and command, that person tends to hijack it for personal benefit. So that's the default situation that we economists have, and we are very grim and dark on that because we think there's no corruption, but people will basically just simply hijack the system to their advantage. So if that's the case, then truly we need a public, we need a theory of what government can and cannot do and how the incentives can be skewed for them to maximize public value. Is there such a theory?
No, sir, not to my knowledge. And you make a very good point. Buchanan comes with the opposite mindset, and his I used to think his points were very wild because I hadn't experienced how things work in Pakistan back then. So, for example, Buchanan's point, one of his points out of the many, was that basically legislators come into office as a kind of business mindset where if you invest 2 crore to get a seat, you must earn 6 crore. That's part of what he said. And I thought that was absurd until I saw how things work here, and he's absolutely right. So, how does public value deal with this idea of elected officials versus the bureaucratic technocrats? It's a blind spot to the extent that it says its crux is that the technocrats must defer to the politicians. No matter how they are, no matter what they say, it must defer to them. And then there is a normative desire in public value that if these officials are, these politicians are who the people want to elect, then as a bureaucrat, your job is just to obey. And the role, specifically the wording in public value, is that the democratically elected officials are the arbiters of value. So insofar as these politicians are crooks, cheats, monsters in many ways, public value cannot encompass that. It cannot assimilate that notion. And then it simply puts the technocrat as subservient with the assumption that that's who the people wanted. And those people then deal with what the people wanted. So the politicians dealt with what. So this is a profound defect and a distance from reality that people like Buchanan cover much, or other right-wing oriented economists cover in a much more comprehensive fashion, looking at the weaknesses of democracies.
So there you go. I have a great idea for you. I just thought about it. That could you do us a favor and write for us a brief note on the differences between public value and Buchanan's, public choice. if we can do a brief sort of what we call a knowledge brief. If you can write a brief distinction between the, I think it'll be very good for Pakistanis to learn what the differences there are. It'll be a theoretical piece. I think you know the subject well. You can write it well. But returning to the subject now, let's think about it. That how do I measure public value? Is there any way to measure public value? For example, could I, as an economist, argue that GDP growth is a good measure of public value?
Well, this is an excellent point. So you're looking for empirical and quantitative ways to stress what is that actual value. And the truth is that public value was written by somebody who was pretty bad at math. It was invented by Mark Moore. He's at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And his interest was not particularly in the dollars and cents. Therefore, public value began as a narrative-oriented thing. And there has always been, as far back as, so public values, so give you a chronology, it started in 1995, it took off in the early 2000s, and since then it has constantly gotten more and more attention, such that you have about 2,000 to 3,000 publications every year. I mean, journal articles on public value. That's the chronology. And ever so often, every 2, 3 years, somebody says, well, we need more empirical methods to assess what this actual value is. How do you do the dollars and cents behind that? For example, as GDP does. And we know that GDP is a flawed way, but it does have gives you some grounding. It's have some use. Public value doesn't have that. Therefore, 99% of the research in public value, or let's say 95%, doesn't have a quantitative element. In my work on public value that's gone into journals, for example, the most important mathematical operation I used was addition, where I counted basically the number of times that the rhetoric of sustainability, or I was using fiscal policy was the area, and how politicians were constantly saying budget discipline in Australia, that's the area, budget discipline, budget sustainability, and I counted how many times it's done, and then I looked at actually how it comes out, and they don't really care about fiscal sustainability. That's the argument in that published paper. So to cut it short, no, there isn't a rigor of a mathematized rigor in public value, and it's one of the greatest defects of this theory.
Why can't we use something like gross national happiness that Bhutan uses, and that Stiglitz and I think somebody else did some work on too. My son also did some work on that. I mean, some kind of a happiness indicator, which includes not just I mean, in the sense, also includes externalities, negative and positive. For example, building society, building community, that could be a negative, positive externality, and environment could be a negative externality, crime could be a negative externality. Can't we devise something like that to measure public value?
Actually, sir, yes, we can. And you've given me a very good idea for a future paper where I seek, or chapter, where I seek the synthesis between gross national happiness as articulated by Leongpo Jigme, the sovereign of Bhutan, and finding that, well, that works on two fronts. First of all, it is in terms of value as externalities, as you mentioned. But second, values, if they're addressed, lead to happiness. So happiness is therefore the conclusion of that. So it would make very good sense. Thank you for that suggestion.
Okay, let me bring in people from the floor. Fatma Sharif. Please, folks, raise your hands, come in, join the discussion. Fatma Sharif, go ahead. Fatma Sharif is there.
Can you hear me? Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Boliye. Fatma, where are you? Oh, she dropped out. Amazing. I scared her away. Sorry.
No, sir, I'm here. I'm here. Sorry.
Boliye,
Thank you so much. Ji, sir. Thank you so much, Dr. Chohan. That was a great presentation. My question is that this is the very important topic that you addressed. That value has a great importance, but mostly people not aware about the value importance. In country Pakistan, the first question is how to aware people about the value theory, because they do not know well about the values, about the social norms, about the traditional, about the political theory, etc. The first question is how to aware or and familiarize the people with it.
Thank you for this question. Actually, PIDE is doing very good work on this. So Dr. Durinayab has done this basic survey, and I think it is the first step towards understanding what the people here value and what their values are. And if you are asking about how to generate awareness about public value, well, you'd be surprised how many of our bureaucrats at a grade 21, grade 22 level do know about it, because many of them are given scholarships to study abroad, including at the Kennedy School, and this is the stuff they learn there. All right, so they are aware. But is there an indigenous focus on this? No, because it is very much indigenous to the Anglophone countries. Public value is centered around Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. This is where they've really taken off. It doesn't even have a continental European following per se. But then again, those societies begin from a certain concept of representative democracy, rule of law, etc. So there, it would make to some extent sense that you would trust your elected officials and follow their orders. Here, as Sir Nadeem-ul-Haque has constantly emphasized, the civil service, and particularly you can count basically 4 people in the civil service who run the country, and that's really who matters. So the context of Pakistan requires an indigenous conceptualization of public value, and that's not just up to me, that is up to you to think about, because addressing our values as a society is very important. And the first step, I think, is what Dr. Durra Nayab and her team are doing in terms of understanding who we are. Thank you.
Sorry, am I unmuted? Yeah, I am. Okay, another thought that comes to mind is, we economists have a theory called welfare economics. I'm sure you read it. And one of the things that happens there is that we talk about a social welfare function. And there's been a long debate on what a social welfare function is and how it can be set up. And I think the conclusion is that we really can't set up a social welfare function. But if we can set up a social welfare function, let's say in Pakistan, one of the biggest items there would be religion, for example. We are a very religious people. I mean, there are more mosques than schools in Pakistan. So yeah, of course, this would be a very big item. But related to the religion also will be the item of the role of women. We would like to keep the women in the home. Now, with that welfare function, are we going to, is that how we're going to measure public value? And so for all the government to work on developing this public value, how would you regard that?
Yes, so sir, using the social welfare function as the example, what you're, as I understand, really asking is that what if people's values suck? Like what if what they really want is awful for society? For example, you keep 50% of your population in a kind of golden prison. What are the outcomes of that? Is that really good for society? Now, public value simply assumes that what people want is the right thing, no matter what it is. So it doesn't have a critical approach towards, well, if what I want is really, really harmful, what do you do about that? And I believe that I've touched upon this to some extent with the necropolitics example, because what if I want things that make other people die or live awful lives, right? So if they have long COVID, I don't care. So that kind of problem is something that isn't touched upon, because if you're trying to give a pedagogy that's feel good to senior bureaucrats, you don't want to touch on the uncomfortable stuff. And that's where I think public value has the most research opportunities to make it a more sober and critical thing, like, for example, critical public administration, which is a different discourse, which had a ton of stuff in COVID because it was ready for this. The thinking was there to address it. So this is a serious defect with public value. In using social welfare is just one example of showing what if people have values that are awful.
No, it's amazing. I mean, for example, in Israel, is public value maximized by the Gaza genocide? I guess if we look at it from that point of view, yeah, public value in Israel is maximized, even though the Gazans are suffering. But I guess that's the way it goes. Ji, Zahid Asghar Saab. Zahid Asghar. Can you hear me, Zahid?
Yes, I can hear you.
Go ahead.
Okay. So how do you differentiate, Dr. Usman, between public value and what we basically call these impact evaluation programs or public spending evaluation programs? and what is basically you see efficiency and effectiveness of public value programs are I don't know. I'm basically confused. What is basically public value and that public value program? Measuring this like GDP is really a tough job. So what's your point of view on this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Zahid Saab. Good question. The clarification is that these impact evaluations are basically a research methodology approach, and it is deployed in public value. Public value is more on the conceptualization of that, and impact assessments are basically a manifestation of that. And impact assessments are often used in public value publications to a certain extent. When you're building a case study, they are applied. So that's the difference. So, impact assessments are used within public value as a theory.
Ji, Sadia Rana.
Hello, sir. Thank you. Sir, my question is that how Sir Chohan see critiques on the development theories. For example, if we say about dependency theories, that limits the addressing borders of societal well-being and sustainability, with more focus on economic and political prosperity, I guess, and an anthrocentric approach. So what do you have views about this?
I haven't dealt directly much with dependency theory, but I do know it. And insofar as public value comes into that, well, it goes back to Sir Nadeem's question and a previous question as well about the applicability of such a theory to a context like Pakistan, where in fact the indigenous locale or the milieu for public value was already a developed society. So development theories were not taken into consideration. And in fact, the development theories that are still in vogue actually predate public value. So it could have drawn upon them. It could have argued, for example, that public managers are developing society based on values, and it could have used some of the metrics and methodologies of development economics. But the pioneers of this theory were not particularly aware of this stuff because they weren't necessarily economists. Some came from a criminology background, some came from a psychology background, but they didn't use much psychology in it. And some came from a political science or pure public administration, like bureaucracy background, like a Max Weber bureaucracy background. So they didn't draw upon this enough, and I'm sure there's room for looking critically, again, using some of the wisdom from development studies in public value, especially when we want to apply it to novel contexts.
Ji, Maimuna Sajjad. Maimuna Sajjad.
Yes, sir. My question is, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
My question is, in what ways do political cartoons contribute to or reflect public value, and how can we measure their impact, be analyzed in the context of societal awareness and engagement?
By political cartoons, you mean ones that critique the government through, funny images, caricatures, that kind of thing?
Yes, the ones that are published almost every day in newspapers, and some of there are digital cartoons as well.
Well, you could argue that, for example, a good cartoonist reflects what the public is thinking but is unable to articulate because of the flaws in democracy. Maybe there's a punitive element. Maybe government has a necropolitical bent that you will be severely punished for free expression. And so these become an avenue for public expression through indirect means. So they are subversive to a certain extent, but they may more clearly articulate values. And then it also depends how the people in power, whether the officials on the bureaucratic side or on the politics side, so the elected folks, how they respond to cartoons. So some cartoons especially in the 20th century, had a very strong galvanizing power. This is true of cartoons in East Germany. This is true of cartoons in Poland. And what they ended up doing is articulate the public resistance or animosity towards how things work, or to critique disvalue in society. So if you're a good cartoonist and you really touch a vein, first of all, you're arguing on behalf of the people, but second of all, maybe power reacts violently to you because you did touch a nerve. So it's a tricky thing.
Gee, okay, there's another thing that's kind of bugging me. I mean, public value, when you say, you're talking about the value created by the government. But as an economist, again, I think of the value that is created in the marketplace. And the value that the government creates in my framework is the value that is created to underpin the market and underpin the private sector and create more jobs and welfare for people. So I cannot measure public value in my framework without looking at private value and how that is created and what the role of the government is in terms of creating private value. For example, I mean, when the government gives you security, property rights, security of contract, and a good framework for operating in the marketplace, I think that's where the public value in my framework is optimized. Now, how does that sit with you?
It sits very well with me, sir, because as I mentioned to you, public value emerged around 1995. So you can see from the historical context that that was a time where the market was preeminent and that there was so much work done in the mid to late 20th century, which cemented the value created by market forces. Partly also neoliberalism and that mindset was so preponderant that if you have this and you can clearly understand through accounting how private firms create value, bureaucrats were feeling bad. Bureaucrats were feeling bad because as they made it to grade vice, they wanted some reason to justify their role. And so, yes, in principle, between us speaking, the sahulatkar, so facilitative role would be the best and the optimum public value. But how would a bureaucrat feel about what they're doing? So the pedagogy had to then draw a parallel from the private market value created, which is clear and accessible through profit or share price or earnings per share, etc., versus this amorphous concept. So this public value was an effort to bring the bureaucrat up to the mark where private was, and therefore it sits well with me because it is very clear how in a market agents are doing. So yes.
But then I have a further problem. See, the problem is that then I would argue that GDP growth or even gross national happiness, measures like that, would be a great measure of public value created. But then what happens is people don't accept that, and especially the bureaucrats and especially international bureaucrats, the UN agencies and all these left organizations that have been created by the UN, they bring in, no, this is not correct. We have to think about inequality. We have to think about social safety nets. We have to think about 10,000 welfare things that give the bureaucracy more power and that erode GDP growth. Is that the framework that we want in public value? Or do we want a hardcore, hard-nosed thing? Guys, just expand GDP, just expand happiness, and let society worry itself, because that also has ramifications for the kind of risk-taking society takes. Because I think, quite frankly, there's another element that I see very often, that we want to eliminate all risk-taking. We want to make society perfectly secure, and bureaucrats will be, or the politicians, the government, will be in charge of your security. With the result, it takes out all incentives to do well. How would you react to that?
Yes, this difficult question that you have posed is often dodged by public value theorists, and they dodge it by arguing for a multi-stakeholder effort. And they lump in all the stakeholders and recognize that each of them has a varying agenda. In our conversations and in your excellent Twitter spaces, it is often discussed what bureaucrats' agenda versus politicians' agenda versus the donors' agenda tends to be. And unfortunately, they often tend to be to some degree at cross purposes, and therefore the public suffers from these suboptimal outcomes. And public value dodges that by saying, well, everybody has to get together and make a happy baby. That's what it says. So it's a facile approach to addressing the difficult question you are posing.
But I think it can be operationalized. If you think of a broad measure like gross national happiness, and we say, okay, this is the measure of public value, and that we will measure each government's efficiency by means of what it's doing to create gross national happiness. But therein comes the issue of the social welfare function. Because my gross national happiness, my happiness, let's say, whatever, my happiness objectives could be very different from Tehreek-e-Labbaik, so, or from Israel, or from, the what is that, Lesenki or whatever, the Ukrainian guy, from the fascist Modi. So, I mean, our objectives, our desires are very different from each other. You may be a globalist, but many people are xenophobic, and their welfare is maximized by killing other people. So, I don't know how we can handle that issue.
Well said, sir. And this is precisely what I sought to first evoke in public value through the necropolitics chapter, because to be honest, I will be happier. Psychology research tends to evidence this, that the relative happiness or the relative status actually means a lot. So if everybody is rich, I won't be so happy. But if I'm richer than others, I'll be happier. And that actually incentivizes me to make sure not everybody is as rich as I am. And so making other people miserable may well be the best source of my happiness, and then their happiness might be in making me miserable. Now, how do politicians contend with this? Well, they probably make everybody miserable. But this is something that I seek to evoke in public value. I just don't think the scholarship is ready or these academics are ready, because their political orientation is centrist. They're neither right-wing nor left-wing. They just want to make public administration great. It keeps being promoted, people happy. That's essentially what this was created for. And that's the wrong reason, where you can actually have much more come out of this.
No, I think that's a very good point made. Again, there's another very interesting thing, a paper done a long time ago, a branch of literature stemming from Formal, etc., which talks about the allocation of talent. And they say talent is allocated according to the rules of society. So if you want a society where robbers and murderers prevail, then talent will go there. But if you want a society where good things will happen, again, good depending on what good is. I don't know what good is, because different people's goods are different. So the talent could go in that direction. So a lot depends on how you configure society, and that society then will, that configuration. So if you set up the rules for cricket, we'll play cricket. If you set up the rules for football, we'll play football. And I think that's very much the way society also runs. You set up a rule for fascism, you get fascism. If you set up the rules for, welfare society, you get welfare. But the issue is, I mean, I think what you're saying is public value is created by defining, first understanding society and then defining the rules, which is a very, fully agreed, but a very complex stuff thing to be done.
Yeah, agreed, sir. An additional point I would like to make on this is what kind of society we aim to be. So as two examples, America is a society built by lawyers today. It's a society where you litigate one another to death, and I'll sue you and you sue me, and a lot of talent goes into law schools, and then they end up litigating themselves to death. China is a society of engineers. Xi Jinping is an engineer. Many people in the Chinese Communist Party are engineers. Being engineers is prized. The benefit of that is that you have the engineering mindset of building a bridge over the problem. But the problem is you might trample through a lot of things along the way. So there are pluses and minuses to what sort of society we want to build. And then the question is, what sort of society do we have in Pakistan? Are we a society of engineers? No. Of lawyers? No. Some people say it's a society of thieves. Some say it's one of wrestlers. I don't know. But it's certainly not one where I see public value being optimized.
Oh, very good, very good, very good way to put it. Very nicely put, very nicely put. Write something on that too. I think it'd be well worth. I think it's a debate that we really need to have in Pakistan, because first of all, I think our welfare function is very poorly defined. You're absolutely right. We're a dog-eat-dog society. We like to cut each other down. The famous thing about the cave in hell, where all the Pakistanis couldn't get out because they were pulling each other down. So yes, that's one of our preferences. The other preference is that we have to put women down. I mean, in fact, I think it would be well worth writing the welfare function of our society, or the social welfare function. I think our social welfare function is, I want to pull every Pakistani down. They all have to be beneath me. Second thing is, I have to show off that I'm powerful. So I have to have $2 and 3 policemen and 20 policemen. The more policemen, the more dollars, the more important I am. Third thing, I have to have 10,000 chamchas around me. I don't feel good without chamchas. And so, they should circle around me. And the fourth thing is, I should have power, and I should abuse power as much as I like. Remember the colonel's wife who said, I'm the colonel's wife, I can throw the barrier away. So that's part of our society. And then the fourth thing is that I don't need to work hard, and that I'll suck up and kick downstairs. And the fifth thing is that I have no honor. That I don't even know what the concept of honor is. I have no chivalry. I don't know what the concept of chivalry is. So I think if you put that welfare function together, then I think our public welfare is being maximized by our current system. And because There's a good sorting out taking place. The powerful people with the dullers sort themselves out very quickly. People like me who are sucker-uppers, we always have to suck up. We sort ourselves out. So we sit in the weak corner, they sit in the proud corner, and we're all happy at what we are doing. So I think that's the way we function. So thank you, Johan Sab. I think this is wonderful. Any last words? Or
Sir, I just want to express my gratitude. I fully support your endeavor to share knowledge among the various institutions. I stand by you, and I want to continue to be of any assistance in supporting PIDE's ambition, inshallah.
PIDE has no ambition except to create public value in academia. So please write these things and give them to us, or publish them wherever and give us the thing. We'll put them on our website too, because it's very important to share this. And I think this debate between Buchanan and this philosophical debate, what you raised today, at least I find it very, very interesting. We have to discuss philosophy of society. And this is what Nayab is doing too in her social capital work basics. We have to understand our society deeply. I mean, as you know, economics is a rational science, or partly psychological. We are really working with human psychology. So in that sense, it'd be wonderful to have your views. Please keep writing and send us your stuff, and we'll do the webinars on your other books too.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. All the best. Khuda Hafiz. Bye-bye.
Allah Hafiz.